Good morning. This is a summary presentation of what I gave in Warsaw to NIRAS International Consulting. The presentation features the organisations with which I am associated, the University of Melbourne, where since retiring as Dean I am retained in an honorary role, ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, which will explain why I introduce livestock examples later in what I say, and ILRI is part of the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research, which is better known as CGIAR, and this encompasses the 15 Green Revolution centres around the world. That too will feature in what I say. And the fourth logo at the bottom of this introductory slide is the Institute for International Development, a small Australian think tank and consulting group with which I have been associated and which is now associated with NIRAS, and particularly NIRAS International Consulting, and for that reason I thank IID and NIRAS for bringing me here to Warsaw. What I would like to talk about today is some way of challenging our thinking so that we see things in the development sphere as learning from research, but also maintaining a wide perspective. With that introduction, let me now summarise the presentation. So let us talk about changing paradigms and integrated thinking. The perspective on which I will apply this concept of integrated thinking relate to development goals and showing how they are interrelated, sustainability as an output of integrated knowledge, means of widening our view for greater integration, talking about the changes occurring in the external world, the perspectives on those changes, and then provide an example as to how we might see things more clearly by talking of the CGIAR and the International Livestock Research Institute to introduce what I consider to be the world's largest development issue. There are various definitions of integrated thinking occur. One is that sustainable development is the holistic integration of economic, social and environmental objectives in an approach to scientific analysis, governance, problem solving and human action. How does this apply in development consulting? This graph simply presents a number of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 consolidated into 10 on the left-hand side, and the consulting units in a large consulting company. The mess in the middle of the series of arrows is simply trying to show how nearly every field listed as a development goal or in the consulting units relates to nearly every other. How can we do this? How can we understand this if we have a discipline basis locked in our silo? Well, if we look through the international consulting window on a changing world, what do we see? Here we are standing at the window as NIRAS Development Consulting, looking through the various divisions of the company, be they climate change or energy or water or science and technology. We see a project, a program, a problem, and we apply our experience and learning. This training and experience gives our window view. We know automatically what we will see. We see what others do in similar cases, and we apply intellectual constructs that we know. Is this really integrating all the parameters and all the knowledge in the best way? Let's consider these diagrams for a minute. Our normal view I present is as being one that is always biased. We think in three different ways that I'll simply summarize through these images from the World Development Report that is current. The first is automatic thinking. We look through our window and we see something through that window and imagine everything outside the frame of the window is exactly the same. But here we are looking through the window and seeing the same thing, yet the outside world is totally different because we assumed things were the same outside our own specific window. We just think automatically that things are the same as what we see. Our perspective is unreliable. The next biased view that we are guilty of is social thinking. Rather than look through our own window, we look at what other people are looking at. And the people in this right-hand window are now looking out and seeing water falling. They therefore think it is raining outside and put up umbrellas. So looking at them, rather than looking at our own window where we might have seen something different, we put up an umbrella because we simply think the way that other people do. This is social think. Groupthink is an example of this. And the third example is that we look through our own window, but other windows might show different things. The right-hand window, as we saw before, shows water falling, so one assumes the whole environment is rainy. We look through our own window in the middle and assume the whole environment is a park-type atmosphere. Or we can look through the left-hand window and see a building and assume that there's buildings all around. This depends on which mental mode we operate in. But if we look through our window and take a wide perspective and see the whole picture of buildings surrounding an indoor garden or park with a fire hydrant that has burst and sending water in the air that falls down looking like rain through one particular window, we have an overall perspective. So an integrated and iterative approach, using the words from the same World Development Report, authored through the World Bank, notes that development professionals, that is us, everybody in this room, are themselves subject to the biases and mistakes that can arise from thinking automatically, thinking socially, and using mental models. It goes on to say that development practice requires an iterative process of discovery and learning, which implies spreading time, money, and expertise over several cycles of design, implementation, and evaluation. This is a truly professional approach, an integrated approach. So how do we widen our view? We have objective thinking rather than automatic social and mental thinking, and we integrate. But when we integrate these things, we can't imagine that it's a static view out of the window because everything is dynamic. So let's ask, what is changing? Many things are changing in our world. Let's go through just a few very quickly. The world has become a much better place for the majority of the people in the world. If we look at the gross world product per capita, we've become extremely rich in recent times. Yet we think we have many problems. If we look at poverty, the graph on the right-hand side shows a dramatic fall. The light blue colour is showing the variation. If you even take the worst, the most pessimistic scenario, poverty is still reducing over time to the extent of this graph, which goes up to 2030. This is an amazing achievement. We should talk more positively about these things. This is the context in which we work, not solving a major problem that's never been solved before, but working on a problem that is a continuous issue of which we are part for our short professional lifetimes, and thereby contributing to something that goes on and must go on as part of the civilizing process. What else is changing? Well, if we look at the graph on the left, which relates to photovoltaic cells and the cost per watt of output, we look at how dramatically the cost of this has come down. This is the development of science and technology. Or if we look at the production of it on the right-hand side, how that has risen amazingly. This is simply one example of hundreds of how technology becomes cheaper through our research and application of knowledge. This is part of the world we live in. If we go to the biological sphere, which of course relates to so much about our lives, but everything to do with food, then we look at what is changing, and the cost for sequencing a genome has fallen dramatically and faster than predicted by any law that comes from technological research. The white line is Moore's law, which is developed from looking at the rate of change and development, the cost of production, if you like, over time of new technologies out of the information technology industry. In biology, it's proceeding much faster, as this green graph shows. What isn't changing? Well, we have persistence of high fertility in Africa. The different lines are the different scenarios that we've become used to for so many graphs like this. And if we look at this, we have to say there is an issue. Here is something that is changing. If we look at the Gini coefficient, this is a coefficient of inequality. And I've tried to put these two graphs, one for China and one for the US, together in a way that their scales somehow match up. And if you look, there's an amazing similarity between these graphs. They may have started at different points, but the way they have gone and the similarity of the levels of inefficiency, which are the levels of inequality, they are rising in both cases. What else is changing? Climate change is the issue. Carbon dioxide levels are shooting up, as we all know, and this is causing, if we take the basic human need of food as our indicator, the drought risk map is showing up more of colours on the map. The more colour, the worse the problem. One of the ways that we look at the environment is through a mental construct of the different factors where we might exceed the ability for the environment to absorb some of the excesses we impose on it. And so red represents where we have exceeded that capacity, past tipping points if you like. Biodiversity is the obvious example. The nitrogen cycle is another part. And if we look at this, climate change is already exceeding the green area, which is considered to be the safe area. So we might say the other areas are fine, but if we look at the headings that are there, and I won't go into detail now, we see that in fact some of these are areas we don't have information about, and others are rapidly rising, where we may soon pass what we think are the tipping points, but we don't know. This is the important thing about science. There is never a final answer. This is the best we have so far, and it will change tomorrow. But we deal with what we have. And that knowledge we have is knowledge that is saying this is the best that I have available to me from the best experts, but tomorrow my mind remains open to new information, but it's my responsibility to chase that information. What else is changing? Well, immigration has increased. I don't have to say any more standing here in Europe. In addition to that, riots and strife have increased dramatically. But they haven't just increased as a matter of politics or some idealistic view of democracy or other concepts as has been promoted by some journalism. They are all part of a wider world of change. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about some of these. Some of the factors are population, environment, inequity, migration, riots, epidemics, and technological change. To understand those changes, we need to accept the dynamic in which we live and apply the knowledge we have from our own learning and our ability to integrate knowledge from other fields. Notice the word integrate. That is the key to what I am talking about. When we look at how we understand changes, we don't want to accept just one view. The slide I put here, which is crossed out by my own crossing, is applying to health. But the idea that crisis is the new normal is not a proper view. This is a false view. It's a way of getting attention. Yes, it works well for that. But we are not in crisis any more than in the past. We are in a situation of more knowledge which identifies problems to us and gives us an ability to work on those areas. Constant change is the norm, always has been. What is different is constantly new knowledge arriving at accelerating rates. And part of an integrated worldview is looking at that knowledge objectively. Remember the windows. How do we understand the changes? Well, another view is to take the Kondratiev graph where he shows cycles. So this is cycles of technology from steam engines through railway, electrification, automobiles and so forth, and then postulating that intelligent technologies may be next. Well, if it's based on the digital revolution, this may solve some issues and create other issues. Here is another view. This one comes from one of my books. It is my view. My view is that the way to understand change and in a development environment in poor countries is that food security is the absolute base. If there is no hunger, then you can have good governance. After that, economic development. Then the social sectors can begin to be implemented in a sound fashion, after which equity can be focused on, and then other ideals, as in our societies. I go on in the book that I will introduce in a minute to talk about how in agriculture and food, for the base of that diagram, the previous diagram, that small farmers, with support from well-regulated agribusiness, provides the basis for the three pillars of good governance, which are feasible self-sufficiency of food in each country, food reserves, and also binding food supply contracts. Why am I mentioning food? Because it is essential for development. Now you can say that I am looking through my window and seeing the problem of food everywhere. What I want to say is, if we take a wide view and look behind issues that may be climate, migration, gender, anything else, we'll find that no enduring change can occur unless food security is well taken care of, both physically in terms of the food availability and accessibility, and also psychologically that people are not worried about where the next meal comes from. Those are the conditions for any other development to occur. This is what professionals in development must always realise, even if they're working in law or any other field, to realise the foundation on which their work depends. The book to which I refer is Beliefs That Bias Food and Agriculture, Questions I Am Often Asked. It's based on 10 questions which are presented there on the back cover of the book. The book is available online from various sources simply by Googling that title. So we can base things on our ideologies or our own views or even beliefs. But let me just say that what an objective view provides is that there is no perpetual crisis. We are not just in a new cycle, and maybe there is a hierarchy of human development. So by integrating our views, we can then identify what is the world's greatest challenge. And yes, you've guessed it already because I mentioned it. It is about food. This graph simply represents on the left-hand side the cost of major cereals, and on the other side the number of riots. This is through the period of 2007 and 8, when there was a huge spike in the price of rice in particular, but also maize and wheat. And what did this coincide with? Riots. Food creates riots. Unless the food supply is adequate, urban people erupt into rioting and worse. This is a fundamental aspect of governance, of law, of so many social aspects of development. Yet food, we are told all the time, should be part of free trade. As I have written in the book, free trade may be a good idea for non-essential items, but for food it doesn't work. Moving corn, wheat, soybean and palm oil, as this indicates, all over the world is the way that world trade works. It follows prices, and we have strange pricing structures, and we have poor countries and rich countries that bias this. Free trade can sort out some of that according to an economic theory, but what an economic theory of free trade cannot do is provide food when there is a shortage of food. In that case, the theory starves people for at least 1 year, and of course that means death. It has happened many times, it will happen again. Where does food come from? This is a graph of billion hectares of land per 1 million people. And we can see how over time, from 10,000 years before the current era until the current time, about 2000, it's declined in this nice, what's more reasonably gentle curve. But we had from thousands of hectares per person, we now down to less than 2 hectares per person of arable land, food production land, and that land is shared with at least 5 animals. This type of agriculture, and I come from agricultural science and I've worked in developing countries for 40 odd years, produces severe degradation of soil. It's because we're using older technologies, or we have used technologies that were not appropriate to the environments. So this is what we rely on for our food production. The yields in Argentina and India, shown on the left-hand graph, are actually going up as a result of agricultural research. Agricultural research investment has been in the past mainly in developed countries, our richer countries. What we have done in our richer countries is run down the investment in agricultural research. This means the world in total has got less agricultural research. So on the right-hand side, which is not to scale, it's just indicative, we can look at how there is a rising gap between where the funds for that research come from if we are to assume continuing increases in yield of food for an increasing population. And of course we know the population continues to rise at least until 2050 under every foreseeable scenario. So the main inputs for food production are breeding of new varieties, whether it's genetically manipulated or whether it's traditional breeding, irrigation by providing water where it doesn't exist, and fertiliser. This means what is commonly called chemical fertiliser. Of course the name is rather a strange name because organic fertilisers are chemical fertilisers in any case. But the chemical fertiliser that is most used is nitrogen fertiliser, and the common form of that is as urea. Here we can see that the Haber-Bosch process developed in Germany at a time when Germany was the leader in the fertiliser research and production of the world, that 1 tonne of urea requires 4 barrels equivalent of oil energy. And 1 tonne of urea produces the grain. So if we look at it another way, it can take about 1,400 litres of oil to feed 1 person per year. Yet there are 7 billion people in the world, or will be shortly. Then there will be more. So how do we keep track and have impact? This diagram is an attempt to look at the many different areas in which the research relating to food production is being conducted. Some of it's called climate change, some of it's called resource use efficiency, but we have precision farming. But out of this are 3 major groups, 3 major changes that are going on. First is hyper-urbanisation, the rapid change in diets that accompanies that when people live in cities. Now more of us live in cities in the world than live outside cities. This is an amazing development in historical terms and creates highly risky scenarios. We have regionalised trading systems growing up, not free world trade, but increasingly free trade or ability to insure each other for food production across regions. And we have a culture of innovation that is spread from the West into other countries, and particularly into China and India. Now let me introduce a short video to illustrate all of these points succinctly from the point of view of CGIAR.
Agricultural research. There is no better investment for development. On our current path, food demand could outstrip supply as soon as the year 2030. People already struggling will suffer from higher food prices and be subject to less reliable supplies, most likely contributing to greater civil unrest and conflict. And improper stewardship of our soils, water and landscapes will erode the very foundations of our food production system. As the world's leading agricultural research partnership, CGIAR is working to create a different future. With over 10,000 people in 96 countries, all of whom are working to produce research and technologies that deliver clear public benefits of reducing rural poverty, boosting food security, improving health and nutrition, and enhancing the resilience of our ecosystems. For more than 4 decades, CGIAR's work has contributed to a never-before-seen abundance of food and affordable prices, high-yielding improved crop varieties, with a focus on native crops used primarily by developing world farmers, sustainable farming methods, cutting-edge policy analysis, new and improved knowledge on key issues such as soil and water management, gender, nutrition, and climate-smart agriculture, and the most comprehensive collection of gene banks around the world. CGIAR research centers work in close collaboration with hundreds of partner organizations around the world, mainly through a series of 16 research programs, some focusing on global staple crops such as dryland cereals, grain legumes, maize, rice, roots, tubers and bananas, and wheat, as well as livestock and fish. Others focusing on entire farming systems such as aquatic agricultural systems, dryland systems, and humid tropics. And others addressing sustainable ecosystems such as climate change, agriculture and food security, water, land and ecosystems, and forest, trees and agroforestry. In addition to programs on agriculture for nutrition and health, gene banks, and policies, institutions and markets. Together they work to generate and disseminate knowledge, technologies and policies for agricultural development. This includes innovative research to help plants photosynthesize more efficiently, vitamin and mineral-enriched crops which especially benefit women and children, and drought-tolerant maize and flood-tolerant rice as a response to climate change. CGIAR's journey continues with a dedicated and highly skilled staff, groundbreaking research techniques, new and strengthened partnerships, a dynamic results-driven approach to our work, and an unwavering commitment to our vision. CGIAR, working towards a food-secure future.
And so you can see why I think the world's greatest challenge is food. And if we add to this that food takes precedence over environmental care wherever people are hungry, that there is increasing demand with the wealth rising in cities across the world, that food is also used, as it always has been, as a weapon in times of dispute, that there is food-induced migration, and we are already seeing that. This is producing and has produced ungovernable countries. There is therefore a need to secure the seeds of and for our human survival. This introduces Svalbard. Svalbard, as this picture shows, is located in an inhospitable place in Northern Europe, in Iceland. Here is its location. It is within the Arctic Circle, and through the generosity of Norway, a facility carved inside a mountain in a very cold environment and kept even cooler, is to store the world's seeds. It is a voluntary storage process that is fairly simple, but it stores food crop seeds, pasture seeds. The ownership remains with the providers of the seeds, so there is no complex international legal procedures, and that it has a low operating cost. And that cost is covered again by the generous donations of Norway. Keeping these seeds is critical because they disappear. They disappear with changing environments, with the way that farmers use seeds, and also through breeding programs narrowing the genetic base. The storage of this in a seed bank, and this seed bank is simply a duplicate for seeds stored in different parts of the world where they are needed, so that everything is a backup that is in Norway. These seeds are critical to the future, and the people that are behind doing this are the same people supporting international agricultural research in order to stave off migration, riots, mayhem, and ungovernable countries. Food demand will continue to rise, and we'll need more and more food for more people. Then people who live in cities require 30% more food than those in rural areas, mainly through waste and loss in transport. The foods that the wealthy demand are more energy intensive in production. Think of a steak rather than soybean. Cereals remain the staples for the bulk of nutrients, but meat and dairy demand is rising faster throughout the world. Now, before we criticise this, let's just be sure that we understand why animal-sourced foods are absolutely essential to good health of the world and the people in the world. It's not about calories alone. Most of the hunger-based literature is talking about average numbers of calories per person. But that doesn't tell us anything about the nutrients or the micronutrients. We know that 1 out of 3 people in developing countries are deficient in micronutrients such as iron, zinc, calcium, and vitamins A, D, and B12. We know that by 2050 we'll be needing huge amounts more of cereals, dairy, and meat to meet demand, but also to meet the nutritional requirements of people in marginalised environments. And this adds up, in terms of cereals, to 1 billion tonnes more of cereals by 2050. It adds up in dairy to 1 billion tonnes of milk, again. And for meat, 500,000 tonnes of meat each year. These are huge amounts to produce from the same land areas, and in fact a declining land area, as we saw earlier. As the world becomes richer, which is overall a good thing, we live better lives. We don't know what to do with our excess in many cases, but at least we are given the option. Many people have not had that option. Many still do not. About 1 billion do not. But amongst that wealth is the generation of high-value commodities. And if we look at the 4 of the 5 highest value commodities, the first one is rice, I should point out, those other 4 are all livestock products. These are absolutely critical things from every perspective, environmental through to food, through to individual nutrients. In addition, the livestock that will inevitably be raised, regardless of what we think, regardless of biased views about vegetarianism, which is such a minor factor in world terms that it's hardly worth mentioning. Livestock introduce another factor that we should be aware of, which is zoonotic disease. A zoonotic disease is simply a disease that transfers from domestic animals, or animals in general, to humans. And we can identify hotspots where this occurs. In the past, this has been in northeast the United States and here in Europe. But as we move into the future, these hotspots are really in Asia, where the bulk of people and the bulk of livestock are in the world. So within all of this scenario, what is international development relying on? Well, it's relying on the development agencies of the past, which people such as development professionals filling this auditorium are used to dealing with, whether World Bank or individual government aid programs. And this has been billions of dollars, but billions is a small figure in terms of international development, and that's why the current scenario planned for the Sustainable Development Goals is based on trillions, not billions of dollars, but trillions are just not available from the old sources. So the way that this adds up is 135 billion from overseas development assistance, plus philanthropy, plus remittances from poor people who have migrated abroad and send money home. Let me just say as an aside that in the poorest of the poor countries, remittances from families abroad working in richer countries exceed aid flowing into those countries. There will also be flows across the less developed countries with each other as trade increases. Then there will be other forms of official assistance and direct foreign investment. These are all factors, and it is pointless to argue in idealistic terms about whether one should have foreign investment, whether one should engage in remittances or allow exploitation of labour. These things are going on. This is an attempt to coordinate these for good. Major development spending is at the national level in each case. The major potential, private sector business, finance and investment. As is summed up in a long report from the World Bank, from the ministerial committees of the Board of Governors of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, it needs a global change of mindsets, approaches and accountabilities. We are back to our windows, not just looking through the same old comfortable windows of our own minds. So there are multiple complex changes going on in the form of donors or funders of the partnerships for development, in the means these are financed, and the globalised issues, many of which have touched on through this talk. And to put these together is what I have called integrated thinking. Integrated thinking will also acknowledge where knowledge comes from. Research and technology drives the spiral for food production. And this works in any other area, but I concentrate on food because it is the absolute critical foundation for everything else. If food supplies are adequate, then the price reduces. And then there's less grown, and there's a food shortage, and population rises, so demand rises and the price goes up and more is produced. And this cycle goes on, and add into this cycle droughts and floods and other environmental catastrophes. It goes on. Yet there's more and more food produced within this cycle. It's usually presented just as a circle. It's presented here as a spiral that's ever widening to indicate that there is more being produced all the time. And this is coming from continued investment in research and technology. Another way of representing this in general terms for development comes from the World Bank's Development Report, where rather than the project cycle with which we're all familiar of identification, design, implementation, evaluation, feeding back into design for the next project cycle, they are presenting it here as a learning environment that cycles ahead like a reflector on a bicycle wheel, so that we have, rather than a circle, we have the contracted side of the circle leading to the next time around, because knowledge is added. Nothing is ever the same in the external environment or the internal environment of our knowledge. This requires broad minds, but we're all broad-minded. We've all been through good universities and understand how it works. We're all intelligent people in the room. We can apply our minds and understand this. Perhaps not everybody does, but we are the people charged with improving the human lot continuously. As I said before, it's been going on for a long time. It will go on beyond us. We are simply taking the baton through our professional lives to carry it forward. Integrated thinking is the way that we do this. The interrelationships include funding, the disciplines we work in, the agencies, and our worldviews. We acknowledge the external environment is always changing, that there are varying perspectives of changes, and the examples that I've given about adaptations for food. And this makes the partnerships we engage in a wider concept. I'll mention again, as I did at the beginning, that the organisations listed at the bottom of this slide, for example, are representing the spectrum of partnerships that will become increasingly common. On the right-hand side, IID, which is part of the international consulting industry, based in Australia, but now associated with this large European group of NIRAS. And this won't be simply agencies like ours working, it will be combinations with universities, such as the University of Melbourne's here, but also with research organisations, such as the Green Revolution Centres or the CGIAR Centres, of which the International Livestock Research Institute is one. So in integrating our thinking, this is the slide I put up earlier. We look through our window at the world, and we shouldn't just see our own view of the world, of climate change being the issue and I'll forget other things, or of energy being the issue and forget other things. We need to understand the essential foundation of food production, and then how everything fits together across different disciplines in the dynamic environment with the knowledge that is changing on a daily basis. I showed this earlier about how we, the development professionals, get locked into automatic social and mental models, and that we need to spend time in reflection about what we have learned and how we can integrate our knowledge. And this leads me to the three conclusions from this short presentation. The first is, as development professionals, we must guard against our beliefs and biases. We must know what interacts with our own fields and be up to date with our own fields. And we must bring this knowledge and this integrated knowledge to service our clients. Our clients are both the recipients of aid or development funds and the agencies that fund it. We cannot separate one as being more a client than another. And so let me conclude with these 3 points that I am sure have come out in what I have presented so far. The first is that we need to guard against our own beliefs, our own perspectives, and this includes those things which we receive from others because we can't keep up to date with everything. But it's our beliefs, our belief that the problem is somehow related to social inequity, or the belief is related to a technical deficiency. All we need to do is guard against our own inbuilt beliefs and question ourselves. The second point is to be aware of how our field, with which we keep up to date, of course, remains interrelated and interacts with every other field. We can't know how this works. We just need to maintain contact and open minds to work in that field called integrated international development. And that is what works in international development. The research inputs, the experience brought to an interrelated understanding of development. And then the knowledge that we have as the professionals in the field is to be brought to service our clients. It's difficult for client agencies in governments and international development banks to remain up to date. The individuals in those have many competing demands and they rely on us, and we must bring our knowledge in an unbiased manner to serve their needs. So taking a different approach and looking more widely with a wider perspective on how things work in international development is the simple message that I hope I have brought to you today. Thank you.